Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this presentation on the FAFSA process. My name is Faith Phillips, and I am the Director of Student Financial Services at The Ohio State University and Central Ohio Technical College. And joining me today is my colleague, Jackie Atkins, who is the Assistant Director of Student Resource Commons at Ohio University Southern Campus. I quickly asked Jackie prior to the start of this presentation how much experience she has in higher ed and in financial aid. And just to assure you, we have close to 60 years of experience just between the two of us. But I say that to just say we don't have all the answers. We never do in financial aid. So we're going to give you a lot of information this afternoon in this presentation. We have about 90 slides that we are going to cover. So we are going to zoom through them very quickly. We will apologize right now. We have 90 minutes with you this afternoon. So we want to make sure that we get through all of our slides. So please forgive us as we speak very quickly and move through the slides as fast as we can. We do have some financial aid experts behind the scenes, though, that are very happy to answer any questions that you might have. So if you do have questions, please pop them in the question box, and the team behind us will be monitoring those and answering your questions as quickly as they can. At the end, even if we're out of time, we will take some time to try to answer some questions that may have been a common theme. So if you have to hop off early, we completely understand that, but we're going to try to get as many of the questions answered as we possibly can this afternoon. Also, in the setup for the session, you should be able to download a copy of the paper FAFSA in PDF. We highly recommend you do this. I don't know about my other colleagues, but every year when the FAFSA was released, I always go and find the PDF version of it, print it out, and keep it next to in my desk, because sometimes it's just easier to get an answer to a FAFSA question if I can pull out that paper application and go directly to the questions and exactly how FSA is answering them. It takes a lot longer to get onto the FSA website and get to that question on there. So I always keep a copy of the application each year in my desk ready to answer any questions that come up. At the end of the FAFSA presentation, we will be covering some of OASFA's resources. Please know that our email outreach@oasfa.org is available all year long. So anytime that you have questions regarding the FAFSA or the financial aid process, we encourage you to send an email to that email address. There's 4 of us that monitor that. And between the 4 of us, one of us will get back to you probably in less than 24 hours. We also have a database on our resource page where we want as many of you to add yourselves to that database. We don't have a formal way to communicate with all of you just yet. And so we rely on you to put yourselves in our database so that when we have presentations like this or we have information we want to get out to you quickly, we have you in our database. So please take the time to make sure that you are in our system. Finally, before we get into all of the content, we're focusing on the FAFSA today. And we know that a lot of students have not started the financial aid process or are in the middle of it. And then they need to have their aid in place in time for fall. So, and we know you're working with them as quickly as you possibly can. But we're also realizing that students are still making decisions on where to go. To say this has been a crazy year is just a repetitive understatement. But these students are still turning to you. I know I'm watching some of my friends post on Facebook. Today's my senior's last day. Schools are already wrapping up. My son's a senior and he has another week. But I know that you counselors are out there just like crazily trying to get transcripts out, and you're probably going a million directions and you didn't expect to. But please know that students are still trying to make those decisions, and anything that you can do and that we can do to help them make those decisions, please let us know and reach out to us beyond this webinar. All right, so I am going to get right on into the slide content here. Maybe. There we go. So just real quick, if you've been in any of our presentations, you know who OASFA is. We're the Ohio Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. The OASFA Outreach Committee is a part of OASFA, and we're the committee that brings all of the training to admission staff, high school counselors, access advisors, TRIO, etc. The information we provide is free, a free service to you. You have permission to copy and distribute our materials. We just ask that you give the permission and the credit to OASFA. And again, this is our email address. As soon as this webinar is completed, we will be uploading the recorded version of it as well as the presentation handout. So what is the Ohio FAFSA 21 initiative? This is supported by the Ohio Department of Higher Education. They have taken funding that they have received as a result of the pandemic, and they have this new statewide effort to increase FAFSA completion for the class of 2021. The grants have been given to community organizations like OASFA, school districts, and agencies to implement these strategies through August for fall enrollment. There has been $1 million issued so far to 23 different groups. So the professional development, such as today's webinar, has been made possible by the Ohio Department of Higher Ed. We're very grateful for their leadership in this and reaching out to OASFA and giving us this opportunity to bring this presentation to you. Again, as I mentioned earlier, OASFA has a website, oasfa.org, and there is a counselors page, and there are many resources out there that we update all year long. All right, so let's talk about FAFSA numbers. So we've been hearing throughout the year that FAFSA numbers are down. The good news is that Ohio ranks 12th in the country in FAFSA completions for the class of 2021. However, we're 6.3% behind the class of 2020 in FAFSA completions. So only 51.5% of the class of 2021 have completed a FAFSA, and that is a concern for us in the financial aid community, and it is a concern obviously for the state of Ohio, and that's why we're bringing this presentation to you. Much assistance is needed in getting these numbers back up to the levels that compete with 2020, which were also down again because of the pandemic. So nationally, we're 6.1% behind the class of 2020. So I don't have to tell you all this, you're living and breathing these numbers every single day in your offices. So we're going to get right on in then to the FAFSA process. We're going to go line by line through that entire FAFSA. You're going to learn more than you ever wanted to know about the FAFSA form. Most of you out there already know about the FSA ID. That is the electronic signature for the FAFSA form. It is the username and password that the student and at least one of their parents create in order to get into federal student aid online systems. First place that every student and parent should begin is at fsaid.ed.gov. The student who is submitting the FAFSA needs to have an FSA ID, and only one parent whose information goes on the form needs an FSA ID. The FSA ID requires an email address and a mobile phone, and you cannot use the same email address and the same mobile phone for the student's FSA ID application and the parent's FSA ID application. Once an email address or a mobile phone number has been used, that number will be picked up in the system and it will not let you use it again. If you ever have more than one student who's applying for financial aid, and I'll continue to use my family as an example. I have a senior in high school applying for financial aid for this fall, and I have a junior in college. So I have two students, they each need their own FAFSA form when they apply for financial aid. They each need their own FSA ID. So my son has one and my daughter has one, but I use the same FSA ID that I created for myself to sign both of theirs. So the parent does not need to create another FSA ID for multiple children. They use their same FSA ID for each child that they're applying for financial aid for. If you're working with students creating the FSA ID, please tell them not to use their high school email address, as these tend to be deleted upon graduation. We want them to create a Yahoo or a Gmail or some type of personal email account that they should be using for the financial aid process, and they should be using that for the college admission process, so that when those email addresses end after high school graduation, they can still access the information they need. For those of you who have been around for a while, you have heard us say for years, FAFSA.gov, FAFSA.gov, FAFSA.gov. That is the website for applying for the financial aid through the FAFSA. However, FSA, Federal Student Aid, has created a brand new web page where they are starting to link more information, so it's all in one place for the student. So you can still go to FAFSA.gov right now, and it will redirect the student to studentaid.gov and apply for FAFSA. So you can still remember FAFSA.gov. We've not been told that that's being ended at this point in time, but just wanted you to know that if a student goes there, it does get redirected to that FSA website. The FAFSA form itself is available in English and in Spanish. And as I mentioned before, this family can access a paper PDF version if for some reason they are unable to do it electronically. Now, over the years, we've seen it where it's about 98 to 99% of the families submit their application on FAFSA.gov. But for that rare student or parent that cannot access that, they can print off a PDF version and fill it out on paper and mail it into FSA. The FAFSA applications open every year, October 1st. So for our seniors in high school right now that are applying for the 21-22 financial aid year, this application's been available since October, but we still want them, they can still apply even though it's been available for so long. That FAFSA is available until next June. The FAFSA will request information from 2 years prior to the date that they're submitting the FAFSA. So we're in 2021 right now. They're filing the 21-22 FAFSA and they're reporting 2019 income on the FAFSA form. Okay, so once you go to FAFSA.gov or studentaid.gov and redirect to FSA, this is what the complete the FAFSA form looks like. If the student has never been in to complete anything on the FAFSA form, they're going to click on Start Here and enter the FAFSA. If they have created a FAFSA record of any kind, then they go into the login page. I think it's important to note this announcement here. FSA will update these periodically based on if they're going to do an upgrade to the system or the system will be down for some reason. You are going to be working with families, as I said, using 2019 tax information. And given the pandemic, we fully expect that families are going to be saying that is not at all indicative of my current financial circumstances. And Jackie's going to talk about special circumstances later on, but I just want to stress that they, if they have a financial situation that has impacted their eligibility for financial aid offices will consider that. And again, Jackie will talk about special circumstances in a minute. The next slide will talk about FAFSA deadlines. In general, the FAFSA comes out October 1 of 1 year and is available almost for, I think, 22 months. So it goes from October 1 to June 30 of a year later, to like a year and a half later. So students, again, if they miss the October 1 release date, the FAFSA is still available for 21-22. The state of Ohio, in order to receive the OCOG, the Ohio College Opportunity Grant, the student must file the FAFSA form, and the deadline date for that is October 1 of 2021. I'm going to get all my 21s and my 22s all mixed up, but FAFSA filing year is 21-22. The deadline for OCOG is October 1 of 2021. So if a student is still, just now filing their FAFSA, they are still getting into consideration for the state financial aid. So once the student has said start here and they get to the login to the FAFSA form, students and parents should not be sharing their FSA IDs with one another. So if it's the student logging in and they've created their FSA ID, they will say, I am the student, and it will ask them for their user ID and password, and it will log them into their FAFSA, and it will pre-populate the demographic information that they put into their FSA ID application onto their FAFSA. If it's the parent that is logging in, they will click I am the parent, and they will have to use the identifiers of the student. Well, here's the I am the student, where they put in their FSA ID username and password. Or if they're the parent, they will have to put in the student's name, social security number, and their date of birth in order to access their FAFSA record. They need to read all the fine print, click accept. I should quickly back up and point out all of these slides that we're using for the FAFSA were created by FSA, Federal Student Aid. We want to give them credit for these slides. And I'll explain to you in a minute why I want to give them credit, because it gets confusing when we see some of the examples that they use that won't apply to our students. So each year until June 30th, the prior FAFSA year does not drop off. So if you go out to FAFSA.gov right now, there are 2 award years out there. The 2021 FAFSA will drop off after June 30th. That's our currently enrolled student, college students that were started in the fall of last year and the spring of this year. So please make sure that if you're helping a student, that they're filing the 21-22 FAFSA for this upcoming award year. Students will be asked to create a save key. It's just a quick 4 digits, letters, whatever they want to create. This is just one more method of protection when they log back in. If the parent is logging in as the parent also needs to know what the save key is. Parents and students can get access to additional information prior to starting the FAFSA. How long does it take? Can I save it? What documents do I need? And then they will be presented with the beginning of the FAFSA application. If the student started with their FSA ID, this will pre-populate. It will already have their social security number, their first, last name, and their date of birth pre-populated from the FSA ID application. So you can see at the top here, these are the different tabs and components of the FAFSA form. You cannot jump to one of the other sections until you've completed each section in order. And you'll be able to see as we go through these slides how they change, and you can go back then to the other tabs. But right now you have to continue forward with answering the questions. It will then be asking for the student's email address. It will use that email to communicate the status of their FAFSA with them and their phone number. Not every question on the FAFSA form is required to be answered. And if it's required and they try not to answer it, it will pop up a big X and tell them to go back and answer the question. If it's not required, it will let them to move on without it. The FAFSA website will save as the student progresses. Every once in a while, you'll see it pop up in green that says your application has been saved. It will then ask the student, have you lived in, and whatever state they said was their state of legal residence, it will say, have you lived in Ohio for at least 5 years? Student says yes. If the student says yes to this, this is what gives permission to the federal processor to release the FAFSA application to Ohio Department of Higher Education to determine the student's eligibility for state grants and scholarships. It will then ask the student, are you a U.S. citizen? So the options for citizenship are, yes, I'm a U.S. citizen, no, I'm an eligible non-citizen, or I am not a citizen. The first two answers, yes, I'm a citizen, or I'm an eligible non-citizen, qualify the student for financial aid. But it's the FAFSA, when it is submitted, it goes up against the Department of Homeland Security's website, it goes up against the Social Security Administration website, and it makes sure that the answer that the student provides here is accurate. And if they are a U.S. citizen and they checked eligible non-citizen or vice versa, it will reject it and let them know that they need to either check the answer to their question, or the financial aid office will be reaching out to them to confirm their status. And we often get in the outreach email questions about citizenship status. So please use that email if you're working with a student to, what is an eligible non-citizen? What documentation will the school require the student to provide to prove their their eligible non-citizenship status? So here's where I want to clarify. So this example that FSA created, the state of Iowa must require a separate state application to apply for their state aid, which is why this is popping up. Again, for Ohio residents, as long as they're an Ohio resident and they've signed the FAFSA and they've clicked submit, it automatically gives permission for the FAFSA form to go to the state of Ohio to determine the student's eligibility for state grants and scholarships. It will then ask, will you have your high school completion status, or what will be your high school completion status when you begin college? So we'll get questions from students while they're still in high school. Well, I'm still in high school. Well, it's when you begin college, what will it be? And most cases it will be a high school diploma. So they will answer high school diploma. They will say that they're working on their first bachelor's degree. This is important that they answer this question correctly. Will you have your first bachelor's degree before the 2021 school year? They want to say no to that. If they accidentally say yes to that, even if their EFC makes them Pell eligible, that question by saying yes makes them ineligible for Pell. Once a student has their first bachelor's degree, if they pursue an associate's degree, a certificate, or another bachelor's degree, they're no longer eligible for Pell Grant, even if their EFC would dictate that they would be. It asks the student, are you interested in being considered for work study? I'm going to go out on a limb and say from a financial aid office perspective, we prefer students say yes to this. And then if they're offered work study and they don't wish to participate in it, they can decline it. Many of us use the answer to this question to determine whether or not we award a student work study. So even if they fall in the family contribution range for eligibility, some schools will say if you said no or don't know, they may not offer the student work study. We don't want them to miss out on an opportunity for funding if they said no, and then when they do ask us for it, we no longer have the funding available. So please try to encourage students to say yes to that question. It doesn't hurt anything. Then they can always decline work study if they don't want it. It will then ask the student, are you male or female? The answer to this question should be based on what is on the student's birth certificate. So we received a question after the last session asking about transgender students and binary students. The answer to this question has to be based on what is on the student's birth certificate. If the student says they're female, it will bypass the rest of these questions. If they say they're male, then it will explain to them the requirement to register with selective service upon their 18th birthday. And in order to receive federal financial aid, they must comply with this selective service requirement. They have the option to say, if they're not registered, it says, do you want us to register you with selective service? They can say yes or no to that, and it does not prevent them from moving forward, and it does not prevent the calculation of the EFC. What it does is if they say yes to it, upon the student's 18th birthday, FSA will send a record to selective service, and it will get the student registered with selective service. And that's one less step they have to worry about. If they say no, they just need to make sure that upon their 18th birthday, they have complied with that selective service requirement. As for the driver's license, this is not a required field, but they can answer it if they wish. This one will ask, are you a foster youth or were you at any time in foster care system? This is not the dependency status question. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is relatively new on the FAFSA, and it's asking this question because if the student says yes to it, when they receive their student aid report, they're given information to help a foster student get into the higher education setting. So we recognize that students coming out of the foster care system may not have a support system to help them through this financial aid process. And so FSA is wanting students to get that information, getting additional information. I also know that schools like mine are using the answer to that question to do more outreach to the students that say yes to that question. So it doesn't determine dependency, but it does give us a little bit more information about the student, and we can do more outreach for them. Ask highest school completed by parent 1 and parent 2. These are not required questions. I do not believe that they are impactful in the state of Ohio. They may be at a college level. The school may be using that to determine if a student is a first generation student. I believe this question is also on there. There are some states that asked for this to be put on there, but it does not impact their federal aid eligibility. You can see up here it says the application has been saved, so it does save while you're moving forward. And you can see we've now moved into the next section for school selection. You can see that student demographics now has a green checkbox, which means I've completed that section. So while I can't click on dependency status or any of these, I could go back to student demographics if I realized, oh, I meant to say yes to work study. I want to go back there, and I can now change my answer to that question. This is now asking for the student to first tell us the name of their high school. We want you to encourage students to use this search feature down here and not type in the name of their high school. When they type in their name, if they misspell it, it may accept it, but that impacts the high school information that is shared back to the Ohio Department of Education and the FAFSA tracking number. So if a student misspelled their high school, they may not be in the FAFSA tracking number. So we want to make sure that they have the high school exactly as it appears in the system. So by using that search feature, they'll be able to find their school and get the correct spelling and correct information for their school in there. So this student didn't use the search feature. They just typed in a few words and it came up with some of the schools, so they can select it and move on to this college selection process. So this is where they now want to tell the FAFSA what colleges and universities they want the results to be sent to. And they can list up to 10 colleges and universities on the first submission of their FAFSA. So if they're saying they're still considering more than 10 schools, they need to put 10 on the first submission, wait till the FAFSA is processed, log in and make a correction, and they can add 10 more colleges and universities on the next submission of their FAFSA form. When they go in to do that, they'll have to remove a school, but that does not send a record or an update to that school to say, hey, Faith Phillips just removed you from her FAFSA form. She's not planning to go there. It does nothing like that. It does not get updated to the schools. So the student can do a search. They can type in the state, the city, and the name of the school, or they can just type in the state and click search, and it will pull up all of the schools that are in the state of Ohio, for example. The student finds the school that they want to select, and they click the box beside it, and then they can click add, and it will add it to kind of like a shopping cart. It moves it from one side over to the other side. And they can keep adding more schools, again, up to 10 colleges and universities. Now, I want to talk a little bit about schools with branch campuses. So Ohio State, for example, all of our financial aid processing is done at the Columbus campus. So if a student is planning to attend the Newark campus, when they go out and do a college search, they won't find OSU Newark, OSU Mansfield, OSU Lima out there. They will only find the Ohio State University. They select that and it gets sent to the Columbus campus, but that's for all campuses. Jackie, how is it for OU?
Sorry, I had myself muted. At Ohio University, the regional campuses all do have their separate school code.
Okay, so perfect example there. So if the student is looking at Ohio State and OU, for Ohio State, even if they're looking at Ohio State Newark, they're only selecting the Ohio State University. But if you're looking at OU and you're thinking about maybe the Athens campus, but also maybe Zanesville, they would select both campuses, correct?
They would. And
yes.
Generally, whichever one they're preferring to go to, because obviously the financial aid office will set their budget, which looks very different for the regional campus than it does to the Athens campus. So it can always be changed. So if they would decide, they decided not to go to Athens and want to come to a regional campus, they, would need to contact the financial aid office and have that budget adjusted so that it would be less, obviously, since they're coming out to a regional campus.
Great, thank you. Didn't mean to catch you off guard there.
That's okay.
So for every college and university that the student lists here, they have to indicate their housing plan. So there's only one school listed here, but had I listed 10 schools, for each school, I would want to say what my housing plans are. So if the student lists Ohio State and OU and Central Ohio Technical College, for example, they may say on campus for OU, off campus for OSU, but for COTC, they may say living with parent. So they could have different housing plans based on, each college and university, but they cannot move forward until they've indicated a housing plan for each college. Quick tidbit right here, when the student is in the school selection process, if they click on the college and they click view college info, great way to compare the different colleges that they're listing. It will give you information such as tuition and fees and whether they have housing and all kinds of quick information for the family to view. Okay, so the students now identified themselves. They've talked about where they went to high school, where they're planning to have their FAFSA sent to. Now we're ready to talk about their dependency status. So the FAFSA will determine whether or not they are dependent or independent for financial aid purposes based on how they answer the dependency status questions. The first question presented will be, what is your marital status as of today? If the student says I'm single, then it will keep presenting them with more questions. Do you have or will you have children that will receive more than half their support from you between these dates? Yes or no. If they say no, then it will ask, do you have any other dependents other than children that receive support from you and will continue to receive that support from you and live with you? If they say no, it keeps presenting them with more questions. So unless a student says yes to any of these questions, they're dependent for financial aid purposes. And we're focusing strictly on dependent student today for the purposes of this webinar. So the student could not check the box that they were currently in active duty. They are not in the armed forces. They were not in foster care, a ward of the court, or both parents were deceased. They were not determined to be in a legal residence. As determined by the state of legal residence, are you or were you an emancipated minor? Nor could they say that they were in a legal guardianship situation as determined by a court. We do get a lot of check boxes on the legal guardianship, and the students are in a custody situation, and that is different than guardianship per FSA. So when the student clicks some of these boxes, more often than not, the college and university is going to reach out to them and ask them to provide that documentation. And often when we see the custody documents, we may have to take a different approach and look at doing a dependency override, or the student may actually be considered dependent for financial aid purposes. So be careful if you're helping a student that feels they were in a legal guardianship, and ask the question, is it legal guardianship or is it legal custody? Because that does make a difference for federal student aid. If they've said no to everything at this point, it will now ask the student, after July 1 of 2020, or on or after, were you homeless or were you self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? And it will continue to ask them questions regarding their homelessness status. If they say yes to any of the homelessness questions or at risk for homelessness, they are considered independent for financial aid purposes, and it will calculate them as independent, and the FAFSA will go to the schools that way. Again, many schools will reach out to the student to confirm that they answered that question properly by asking them for some documentation of this status. So in this scenario, the student said no to all of these questions. It now says, FSA is determined based on how you answered. We've determined you to be dependent, and you must provide parental information on the FAFSA form. The student still has another option. They can say yes to providing the parents' information, or if they have unusual circumstances that were not defined in those dependency status questions, they can click the box, I'm unable to provide information about my parents. It will allow the student to move past parent demographics and parent financials, answer the questions about the student, and submit the FAFSA. It will go to all of the colleges that they have added onto their FAFSA form, but it will not calculate an EFC, and then the college and university financial aid staff will reach out to the student and take it from there to determine what their circumstances are and what we can do to assist them. Jackie, you're gonna have to yell at, oh, never mind. I see the screen side number. Never mind. Okay, so we're now into the parent demographics. Very important that the student stops and thinks about who their parent is for the purposes of the FAFSA form. And they can click this link right here that says parents, and it will define the parent for the purposes of the FAFSA form are only biological or adoptive parents. If those biological or adoptive parents are divorced but remarried, the other parent, the step parent, now becomes the other parent for the purposes of the FAFSA form. So it gets a little bit tricky when you have a divorced and a remarried situation. So let's take, for example, the student is using their mother to file the FAFSA form. Mother and father are divorced, but mom is remarried. Mom's marital status is going to be married or remarried. And the date that your parents got married or remarried is actually the date that her stepdad and mother got married, not the date that her biological parents got married. So it's a little bit tricky, and we tend to get this confused a little bit. So the marital status for the parent that is filing the FAFSA is their current marital status. And then the marital status date is the date that they married or remarried. Then it will ask the student to list their first parent's information and the second parent's information. They need to remember who they listed as first parent and second parent. When they get to the signature page, whoever has the FSA ID, they'll have to select that parent to sign. So if I'm filing the FAFSA, I have the FSA ID and I make myself parent number 1, I want to remember that. So when I get to the signature page and it says who's signing it, I will say parent number 1. So we do ask for parents' social security number and their date of birth and a separate email address for the parent. The FAFSA not only goes up against Social Security Administration database and confirms the student's social name and date of birth, but it will also confirm the parent's Social Security number, name, and date of birth that they match. And then here is parent two's information. I think I might have gone this side. Okay. Then it will ask again, have your parents lived in whatever state of legal residence for at least 5 years? They don't all default to Iowa, I promise. And then it gets to the household question. So it wants to know how many people are in the student's household. So the top 2 questions are automatically answered based on how the student said their parents' marital status was. So if they said they were married, it will automatically put 2. And then it always adds 1 for the student. So at the very minimum in the student's case, there's 3 in the student's household. Then it will ask, do your parents have other children, even if they don't live with your parent, that the parents provide more than half of their support for, and will provide that support between July 1 and June 30. Or if the child was to file a FAFSA, could they say no to all of the dependency status questions? And if they have children that fall in that, then they would put the number of the other children there. So for my son and daughter's application, there were 2 parents, 1 student, and 1 additional child in the household. And then we do not have any other people that are in the household, but if they do, it's other people. If they live with the parents provide more than half of their support and will continue to provide that support. So say grandma lives with us as well, but grandma has her own income that comes in, and grandma contributes to the household expenses. Even though she lives under my roof, I would not put grandma in the other people in the household size, because she is not, even though she's living with me, she is not getting more than half of her support from me. So that's how you determine if that other person gets added into the household size. And then the number in college at the very minimum needs to be 1. That's the student that you're submitting the FAFSA for. If you have multiple children, if they have multiple children in college at the same time, then they would increase that by the number of children. Parents that are in college do not get to be included in the number in college on the FAFSA form. That may be something that they could appeal to the financial aid office, but for the purposes of the FAFSA, the parent themselves in college cannot be included in the number in college. All right, Jackie, am I supposed to go to 41?
I'm afraid not to mute myself when I'm not talking. You know, I start at 50.
Thank you. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay. So now the parent is answering their questions about their income tax. So they will indicate whether or not they have filed their FAFSA. Nope, they will indicate whether or not they have filed their taxes and what type of tax return they filed and how they filed, whether it was married filing joint or married filing separate. And then it will present them with the link to the IRS. And you've heard us say this many, many times. We highly encourage you to encourage your parents and students to use the IRS data retrieval tool. It is a faster way to get the information added to the FAFSA. It's a cleaner way to make sure that the data gets dropped in properly and no mistakes are made. Most people can use data retrieval if they're just now filing their taxes, since we're just now up against the tax deadline. They won't be able to use data retrieval if they're filing their FAFSA right now. But most families should be able to use the data retrieval tool. They do have the option, if you can see, it's down here in teeny tiny print where it says no thanks. The link to IRS is a bigger box, but they can click no thanks and it will allow them to move forward to the screens where they can add and type in their own information. So now it's asking the parent, what is your adjusted gross income? And it tells them. The amount is found on IRS Form 1040, line 8B. So the FAFSA itself will give them the instructions on where to find that information. It does not allow them to put cents in, so just make sure that they're not typing 28,050 cents and making it 280,000. They just want to be very careful that they're not adding extra numbers that will impact their EFC significantly. Then it asks them, of that adjusted gross income, tell us how much did the parents each earn from work? And it wants them to break it up. So remembering who parent 1 is and parent 2 is, they want to say how much did each of those parents earn. And if they have a W-2, that's where they're going to go. They're going to look at it on their W-2, they're going to find that income, and they're going to put it there in the appropriate box. And then it's going to ask them some information about how they filed and could they have filed in as a dislocated worker. They may not know that. We don't get these very often. I believe there are states that use the questions and answers of this. At my colleges, we've never used the answer to this question for anything. But it will also ask them, did your parents file a schedule? Select no if they did not file a Schedule 1 or only filed a Schedule 1. They just need to read these questions very carefully and make sure that they answer them to the best of their ability. This next question is very key. It will not impact their eligibility for federal and state aid as far as the amounts, but it could allow us to exclude, for example, assets that are reported if they received any of these federal benefits. So it will be very specifically ask them on the FAFSA, did you receive or your parents receive any of these? And if they click the box, then it allows us to know whether we can include them in what's called a simplified needs test and exclude assets. This does not say, oh, they're getting another federal benefit, so we're not going to give them any federal aid. It is just basically to clarify the student's need for aid. Then you will enter in the income tax. See, this is why it's much easier to use the IRS data retrieval tool. But they will then enter in the income tax, and this gets messed up quite a bit because they go and look at what their federal, how much they paid in that federal box, and they put the wrong figure here. So again, the FAFSA will tell you exactly what lines to find this information on the tax return for the student and parent. Then we're on to any untaxed income and benefits that the student and parent receive, and it pre-populates with 0, so it won't allow them to go forward without answering it, so it pre-populates it with 0. But this is where they have to really slow down and carefully read each question and determine whether or not they have to report anything in any of these lines. So we'll talk about combat pay, student college grants and scholarships that were in your parents' income. This will be found on a tax return. Education credits, again, on a tax return, tells them exactly where on the tax return to find this information. So it's just best that they go to the tax return for each line that's indicated here and make sure that there's not an amount that needs to be reported here on the FAFSA form. Then it will ask, did this parents pay child support as a result of a divorce or separation? So if I'm divorced and I have children that are living somewhere else and I pay child support, I can put the amount that I paid in 2019, not what I paid last year, but 2019 here, and it will reduce the adjusted gross income by the amount that's going back out of the house. So I reported that I made $50,000, but $10,000 of that goes to my ex-husband for child support. That is saying I've got money going back out, so it reduces it. So it helps you by reporting that you paid child support. Now you cannot report here child support paid out, but also include that student in the household size. It's one or the other. So if things have shifted and they're living with you now, we're going to question you on why did you report them in the household and why did you report that you paid child support as well. You can't report both. And then earnings from work under cooperative education offered by a college and taxable earnings such as federal work study. So this is an important one right here as well, not for a senior in high school right now, but for a student that's with us right now and they're earning federal work study. That is a part of their income that's reported in the tax information. They want to report how much of that was work study here, so it also gets excluded. So even though I made $5,000 and I reported I earned $5,000 in the income section, but $5,000 of it was work study, I want to exclude it back out. So we're not penalizing a student for financial aid that they earned under the work study program. Then it will ask, did you receive child support? So for the family that received child support in 2019, they have to report how much they received here. Now that's 2019 and we're in 2021. That's where Jackie's going to talk here in a few minutes about special circumstances, because that usually stops when a student graduates from high school or turns 18. So they have to report on the FAFSA how much they did receive in 2019. But Jackie will explain how to do an income appeal related to that. Then if they received any housing, food, or other living allowance, this is common for military and clergy, they have to report a cash value for that here. Any payments to a tax deferred pension or retirement savings plan, right there in the W-2, and it tells you exactly what boxes to go look for on whether or not a figure has to go in this box. And then any veterans non-education benefits that they receive, such as disability, death pensions, they need to put the value of that here. And then any other untaxed income not reported, such as workers' comp or disability benefits. So anything else that is considered untaxed income that did not get reported in any of the box above need to get reported in this box.
It's my turn to take over, I guess.
Yes, you're on.
Okay, and I have my cursor right over my mute button this time, so I was ready. So we're going to move on into the FAFSA. After the families get through the parent section, it does flip to asking, oh, I'm sorry, are we not on 50 yet? I started with 50. Am I in too soon? Guys, sorry, I was excited.
That's all right. Just this is the sorry, and I believed you, so
Yeah, that's my fault.
that's okay. So just real quick on assets. These are as of today, or the date that they're signing the FAFSA form or filling out the FAFSA form. So everything we've talked to you up to this point is 2019 tax and untaxable income. This is as of today. They want to answer for the parent, what is your total and current cash savings and checking account? And if a student or a parent is sitting there saying, yeah, I've got $10,000, but my Discover bill is coming in a couple, in a month or so, and I'm going to pay off my Discover bill. It's as of the date you sign that FAFSA form. So while we don't want students, especially at this point, to postpone paying, doing their FAFSA form, I suggest they spend that money so that they can honestly say that on the date they sign the form, that what was in their cash savings and checking account. The next question we'll ask, as of today, what is the net worth of your parents' investments? Now you can't, well, I guess you can. If you see this question mark right here, I highly encourage every parent to click that box and read what the definition of an investment is that needs to be included here. So for example, they don't include the value of the home they live in, but if they have real estate property, they have to include the value of that real estate property. And any investments they have, such as stocks, bonds, or CDs, they need to list the value of it. But if they have a traditional retirement account, they do not list the value of that. So it's very important that they know what we consider an investment. I'm working with a student right now at OSU Newark whose mom accidentally reported her entire 401k there and wanted to know why she wasn't eligible for Pell this year. And that's a mistake, and we can help her correct it. But we want to make sure that they know up front exactly what is included as an asset and what is not included as an asset. And then it will ask, as of today, what is the net farm of or net worth of a business or an investment farm? Again, click the question mark box. A lot of people don't need to put anything in here, because if they have a business that has less than 100 or fewer employees, the value of the business isn't listed here. If it's a family farm that they live on and operate, they don't need to list the value of it. So we want to make sure that they use those question marks to get the information so that they answer those questions properly. All right, Jackie, I'm going to take a breath now and hand it over to you.
Is it really my turn? I really apologize.
Really.
I was excited to get started on my slides. So we're officially halfway and about 5 minutes behind schedule. So my parts may go a little faster, but we do, after you get through that parent information, the FAFSA does automatically flip to the student. And this is one of the mistakes I see commonly done with families when I'm out doing FAFSA workshops, is they don't pay close enough attention that has flipped to the student. And then they start filling their information back in. And I've actually seen families submit it with their income reported twice. So obviously that's a huge mistake that you don't want to see the families do, because their income is in there twice and getting counted twice, and is one of those things that they work with the school to correct. But it's going to ask basically those same questions of the student that they just have gone through with the parents. So if most high school students, probably the majority, don't work. So a lot of these questions become very simple. But if they did, they would mark they filed, their tax return. Most of them obviously are going to file single while they're still in high school. They can also link to the IRS, and that's encouraged. Obviously, we're going to talk a little bit about verification coming up and some of the steps that it saves them if they can use the IRS data retrieval tool. Obviously, there are families that can't for whatever reason. Sometimes it will not let them link, and they do have to fill that information in. Next slide, please. Again, this was talking about linking out to the IRS data retrieval tool. So if they are going to use the data retrieval tool, they do have to either their FSA ID, they logged in with their FSA ID at the beginning, or they're going to ask them to link over to the IRS with that FSA ID now. So the parents would also have to have their FSA ID set up to be able to use the data retrieval tool as well. And again, if they're filling in, these slides are going to show you what a student would do, obviously, if they're having to fill it in and not using the IRS data retrieval tool. Again, as Faith mentioned, it tells you exactly what line to look at on the tax return, but things can still be confusing even using those lines. So that's why they really encourage, if they use the data retrieval tool, it tells them right there that it was pulled over from the IRS, and they don't need, it was transferred, and they don't need to do anything further with that line. And we do encourage them not to make changes to what the IRS pulled over, because then it does change their status a little bit. If they would be selected for verification, then they might be back into having to verify that. Next slide, please. And here, a lot of times, again, that this would come over from the data retrieval tool, but if they're filling it in, a lot of times it might be the same as the adjusted gross, but it could be different. So it does tell them where to look for this. Their W-2 generally is where they would be probably pulling this information as well from what they earned from work. Income tax, like Faith mentioned, very, very common mistake here. People try to pull this from an incorrect place. Or one of the other common mistakes I see is they put their adjusted gross here. So they made $35,000 and they say they paid $35,000 in taxes. So obviously that's a huge mistake. So they really need, if they're filling this in, to double check that line that they're pulling that from and make sure they're putting the correct information. Again, the same questions Faith just went over in detail. Generally, they populate with a 0. Obviously, if the student has these things or they don't come over, they might be things that didn't get transferred from the data retrieval tool. If they used it, they can go in and make changes. But I think the majority of these come over with that data retrieval tool if they've used it. Probably won't see this a lot with high school students, but child support that they possibly pay, like she mentioned, this doesn't get counted in their income. If they put how much they paid for a child that, obviously they're not supporting or living in the family with them. Also, the other two questions, again, students, once they've become college students for a year, they might be earning work study. So it's important for them to include that on their FAFSA, because like she mentioned, it gets excluded. They don't count this against them as far as income in the FAFSA report. Again, moving on to questions we kind of already looked at, so I won't spend a whole lot of time with them. Child support, if they would happen to be receiving child support, they would include that here for, again, child that's, they're not also counting the family, if they would be paying for a child that's not living with them. Payments to tax-deferred pensions, if they would be doing this at a job they had, that information they can pull from certain boxes on their W-2, and it tells them exactly what to include there. Which numbers to include and codes to include. So, they don't want to include things they don't need to. And I see this happen a lot with students and parents. They want to include their entire retirement plan in these numbers. And obviously those aren't things that go there. So they need to make sure they only count the actual things that need to be put in those boxes as well. And then any other types of untaxable incomes that they might have, which again, generally for most high school students, you probably won't see a whole lot in any of these last few screens that we've talked about. And then these do have to be populated. If the student if they don't have anything, they just put 0, but they won't let them leave these blanks. So make sure they go through. Again, they might have some savings and checking accounts. They might, generally most high school students don't have a lot of investments in things yet. Obviously, if 501 plans and things are in their name, things like that sometimes get counted in these areas, but a lot of times I think they have to be possibly a certain age and things before those count on their side and not the parent's side. But probably businesses or farms are going to be coming into play with with any students graduating from high school. Next, it will ask you if you are a preparer, and as you'll see in parentheses, it said this is rare. The family, the student, the parent are not considered preparers. This would be maybe if they were paying an accountant or a tax preparer or somebody else other than the family that's completing this form. That would be the only time that this would be changed to yes, and then I think they ask for a preparer number, which if they do prepare FAFSA, they should be able to include that. But I've rarely, or I don't know that in all the years I've been helping with FAFSAs, I've seen very many people say anything but no to this question. So basically, as a counselor, if you're helping them, you don't put in as a preparer. They're still doing their FAFSA. You're just assisting them with it. Now, this is the FAFSA summary. This is something I do encourage as I work with families and parents that they print this off if they have access to a printer, or if not, that they definitely, this is a great time for them to review their FAFSA, make sure their information is correct because they have not submitted yet. So at this point, if they see a misspelling, a wrong date, they put something in wrong, if they were reporting their income and not using the data retrieval tool and they put a 0 in that shouldn't have been there, that makes their numbers look a lot different and more than what it should be, they certainly at this point can go back into the FAFSA. So we do ask them to look at this very closely. So basically, you'll see here it's just a listing of all the questions. So they just scroll this first page, shows all their personal information, what their plans are in college and the colleges that they've listed. And then it moves on into a couple other pages. So it'll show the parent information, what they put there, the student information, financials, parent financials, basically reviewing everything that was on the FAFSA. Then you move into the signatures, and a lot of times if both the student and parent had FSA IDs already populated in the FAFSA, a lot of times all they'll have to do is first the student would click, they want to provide their signature, so they would click there, and so would the parent, and then it will take them to the next page. There is an agreement. They do have to click here. A lot of people miss this and try to proceed without clicking, and it will take you back. But basically, this is, they would want to read through this. This is where they're saying that they're not falsifying any of the information that they're giving on the FAFSA, and that there might be penalties and things if you do falsify your FAFSA intentionally. So they would want to read through that, and if they're in agreement with everything they've included, they would click agree, and then it would take them to click on sign the FAFSA. And so it shows on the student side, everything is good to go. And then you move on to the parent, and they would click provide the signature. And this is, like Faith mentioned, important to remember who's parent 1 and 2. Both parents do not have to have FSA IDs, but one or the other does. So whoever went in as parent 1 or parent 2, and whichever parent, whether it was 1 or 2 that had the FSA ID, they need to make sure they click correctly here, and then they'll provide that information. So if it's parent 1, they would click there. And then they do the agreement as well, just like the student did. And then here, if the parent didn't already have their information in there, or sometimes it may ask the student and the parent to enter their FSA ID information again as well. This is where they could put it. To use the data retrieval, they would have had to already have it into the FAFSA. But if maybe they didn't use the retrieval, at this point, if they haven't set up their FSA ID and they want to sign the FAFSA electronically, which is obviously the recommended way to sign, you would have an option to set their FSA ID here as well. And then they would click sign. Now, some other options, I've worked with families that for whatever reason, they have issues getting an FSA ID established. There are some other methods for signing the FAFSA. Obviously, electronically is the recommended, but the students can print a signature page and they can sign it and they can mail it in. Obviously, that's a little slower way of doing that, but if they're working on an issue with the FSA ID and they want to go ahead and send it in, they could still go back online at any point if they got that issue rectified and sign it. But in the meantime, they could go ahead and send that in. The other option is they could, they don't have to necessarily save the FAFSA at this point and go back to do the signature. They can submit the FAFSA without signatures. They just need to remember if, it gets processed pretty quickly and sent to the school is going to receive it saying that there was no signature or signatures, depending on who couldn't sign on the FAFSA. So you would, have to go back out, complete the FSA ID, go in and submit that signature if you decide to go ahead and submit without the signature, because that will be how the school receives that information. So the student, the parent, whoever might be having the issue would need to, one way or the other, get that signature issue resolved, because that would result in the financial aid offices not being able to move forward with their FAFSA information. So then if you get both signatures in there electronically, you'll see that the student is in there electronically, the parent is in there electronically. Now, believe it or not, some families might stop right here and not finish and move on and click the submit button. So it's pretty important that at this point, they don't forget to go down and say, submit my FAFSA now. And then it'll tell them, congratulations, you've successfully submitted. Again, if the student isn't ready to submit, let's say there's some issues with their FAFSA, they certainly don't have to submit it. They can save it and go back in and correct anything if they're not sure that one of their answers are maybe correct. So I would probably recommend saving and fixing that before submitting, because once submitted, it's going to go to the school and then they would need to make corrections with the school if necessary. But at this point, they could have saved it and fixed it and, and then submitted it. But what a lot of students forget to do is they've saved it and it will only save for so long. And they've forgotten to go back in and fix what they needed to. So just keep that in mind. If they're not ready to submit, there's a problem with the FAFSA, they certainly can save it. But if they do submit it, they'll see that they get a confirmation page. This is another thing, if I'm doing FAFSA workshops with students and have access to a printer, I do encourage them to print this off. They can keep this for their records showing that they did successfully complete it. A lot of students now do screenshots and things of their FAFSA, since they have cell phones and things and can do that and prefer to do it that way too. They just have a record that they did submit it. It gives them a confirmation number, another DRN or a data release number, and some other information there. It tells them kind of what happens next. They're going to submit their FAFSA to the schools they listed, on their FAFSA, processing time, The students will get a notice, an email notice that it's that's been processed and it's on its way. On this confirmation page, if you are working with students that live in Ohio, that you probably will not see, or they will not see on their confirmation page, is right there where that cursor that says start your state application. Like Faith mentioned, this was processed and done for the state of Iowa, which would require maybe the student to do an extra step. In the state of Ohio, if they have submitted their FAFSA by that October deadline, they automatically, by signing that FAFSA, they're giving permission to have that information transferred over to the state, so they can also be considered for the Ohio College Opportunity Grant. But something that a parent might be interested in is right there on the right-hand side. You said that you have a brother or a sister needing to complete the FAFSA. So if there's another sibling in the family that is also going to be in college that same year, they can click in here, and that information for the parent will automatically populate into that second FAFSA, so they don't have to go back through all of that information again. So that is a pretty helpful item for those with more than one child in college. To the right side, you'll see it also gives them an expected family, estimated expected family contribution. And I know that doesn't mean a whole lot to families because they don't have the chart to tell them exactly what that means, but that is information that the school will use, obviously, to determine any grant eligibility, financial aid eligibility. So that's important information for the schools. It also, any schools that they've listed on the FAFSA, it also gives a little information about each of those schools. So graduation rates, retention rates, transfer rates that might be in the system could be generated here so that they can have some additional information about each of those schools. In this case, there's only one school listed, but as you know, students can list up to 10. So they may have lots of information here for various schools. So next comes the student aid report. This is something that students can access after, it's not very many days after they file the FAFSA that they generally will have access to their student aid report. And when they go back, you'll see that it'll tell them their application status. You know, it was processed. If it wasn't processed, it would tell them that as well. If it was, you know, there was some other status, but this one, in this case, the student processed successfully. And it gives them the option where they could view or they can print it. So another place that they can go and look and make sure their information's correct. One of the other things that we don't talk a lot about in this presentation is that second one down where it says make FAFSA corrections. So let's say they did submit and found out they needed to make some correction to their FAFSA, or maybe there's another school that they missed and they want to go back out and add a school. They would go in to make FAFSA corrections. So that's another place that's commonly used when they log back in to the FAFSA. So then this is what the student aid report would look like. Gives them, you know, any comments, anything about their FAFSA. It, again, line by line, tells them their answers of what they put on the FAFSA. And then this is just another continuation. So they will have this record here as well as, you know, if they printed their summary. It does go to those graduation, retention, transfer rates again for any schools they've listed. Also, if they, you know, obviously just getting started in college and straight out of high school, they probably wouldn't have a financial aid history. But one of the things they can review here as they're in school, you can see it will also let them know their history of student loans, different information that will also be included on the student aid report as well. Verification, obviously, is a process. If you've been working with students for a while, they may have come in and said, you know, my school's asked me for copies of this and copies of that. And obviously, if they're, you know, asking for tax return information or other certain forms, the student has probably been selected for the process called verification. Roughly 18% of FAFSAs are selected by the Department of Ed. Students eligible for a Pell Grant will be selected at a much higher rate. So they do look at those students that might be grant eligible a little bit more, just to make sure, you know, they are. And I don't think the majority of students make errors on their FAFSA on purpose, but unfortunately, some errors can lead to the loss of the eligibility that was originally there. So if they've underreported income, you know, misreported, forgot to put, you know, information on there that needed to be on there, or didn't know that it needed to be included, obviously verification, the verification process at the schools can make adjustments to their aid eligibility. So we really encourage students to respond quickly to any of those requests. Some students respond very quickly. I will say many students do not respond until maybe a week before classes start, or possibly after classes start. So as someone that works at the college, I do really encourage students, obviously, to get that information back in as soon as possible. One, it will delay their awarding of their financial aid for that academic year. So, you know, if the semester is getting ready to start and their financial aid is not in place, obviously, there may be some issues with that, or they'll be starting without knowing, you know, exactly what they're going to be receiving. So verification is pretty important, that they get it completed and back into whatever information the school is asking for as quickly as possible. Another thing, the schools can, if they see some discrepancies in some information they see when they receive the FAFSA, students can be institutionally selected as well. So just because they made it through the federal cut may not mean that they may not get selected by the institution when the FAFSA arrives there as well. Some commonly requested documents if they do get selected: verification worksheet, probably one of the most common documents I see the student get sent for verification, and they can look very different. The school usually can actually create their own verification worksheet of things they want to ask the student, but generally, you know, it's just some general questions about their family size, their tax filing statuses, marital statuses, parents' information, and, you know, as a dependent student, they'll probably be reporting some parental information on this as well. So they would ask the student to complete that. The one thing I always see happen on those is they're not complete. They leave things blank that obviously need to be completed. So they do need to make sure they read every question carefully and answer accurately, and make sure an answer is there. If it's left blank, the school doesn't know if it should have been answered or not. So it's pretty important, you know, to make sure they answer all of those questions on that worksheet. They may ask for a tax transcript or tax return for 2019 of either the student or the parent, or both, depending on what information they're needing to verify. Again, generally, if they use that IRS DRT, they do not have to, and they've not made any changes to the information reported. Most schools will waive that tax return request because they know that's come from the IRS and they know that it's accurate. So a lot of times the schools will not ask for that. They might ask for W-2s if the student worked in 19 but didn't make enough to have to file. They may ask for their W-2, or there could be other reasons. They might also include the W-2 in there. For students or parents that did not file and they get selected for verification, generally they're going to need to make a request for what's called a non-filing letter, and there is a form called a 4506T where they can request that information if needed. The IRS will send that to them, and then they can supply that to the institution that's requested it. Special circumstances, Faith hit on this just a little bit, that there are obviously circumstances that lead to a student needing to possibly ask for an exception or using a different year of income because they've had some major changes. And obviously schools are, due to the pandemic, the schools are preparing obviously to see increases in this process in the next year or two. Eligibility for financial aid, as you know, for 21-22 is automatically based on 2019 income, which may not be a true picture of where a family is currently standing right now, as far as loss of income, loss of jobs, things that have happened in the past year and a half. So most schools, to remedy that, will have a process in place. It may be what schools may call it a special circumstance form. Some schools, like we call it a change of income, so schools can call it various things. But each student is looked at on a case-by-case basis, and they will have to provide documentation. There might be a form they can complete separately and submit. But students need to realize they're reporting on FAFSA their actual 19 income. They're not changing what they think their income should be because of the loss of income on their FAFSA. They are using that 19 income, and then they're contacting the school to say, I have a circumstance where we made this, my family, my mom, dad made this in 19, but we're not going to be making that in 20 or 21. So it's really important for those students in that situation to reach out to their institution, that if they're planning and looking at several different schools, and they want to know where they stand at each school, they would have to complete this process individually at each institution, or once they've made that final decision of where they're going. If they make that soon before the start of the semester, they could work with that one school, because every school is going to want to do their own process, kind of an internal process. So they would have to, if they're looking at 3 different schools and they want to know how this is going to affect them at that school in receiving financial aid, they would have to do this process with each of those schools. Special circumstances, of course, are conditions that exist which cannot be documented or explained on the FAFSA, like I've already mentioned. So that loss or reduction of employment, wages, or unemployment compensation, loss of untaxed income or benefits, such as that child support that we mentioned, a separation, divorce, or death after the FAFSA. So something happened, a parents divorced, and both their incomes were already reported on the FAFSA. Obviously, in a divorce situation, one or the other of those parents at that point would be reporting their income, and of course, it would be something they go back out to the FAFSA to do. They would work with the school to make that change. So just some examples of special circumstances. Obviously, we talked a little bit about that loss of child support. Obviously, that can happen, with graduation, turning 18, and that income is, going to be gone at that point. And of course, they could have received that the whole year of 2019, and now they're not, possibly the whole year of 2020, of course, none of 2021, would they maybe be receiving that, so they can report that to the school. Obviously, a divorce situation after filing that FAFSA, can certainly make a big difference. A parent or a spouse, the death of a parent or spouse, unusual uncovered medical and dental expenses. I know a lot of people don't think about that one, but this would be basically medical or dental expenses that haven't been covered by insurance. So these exceed what insurance is covering. Obviously, the schools might ask for receipts and things like that for what the family paid out of pocket. If it becomes a certain amount of their income, then that could make an adjustment. Obviously, probably the most common one we're seeing right now would be that loss of income or employment, and extraordinary dependent care. That's another one that a lot of families probably wouldn't think to report, but that can also be considered a special circumstance as well. So finally, we have some resources for you guys. We want to mention, obviously, there's resources out there for parents and students as well, but there are resources and tools provided to counselors on this site. Training registrations are located here. Obviously, this is probably where you went to register for the event today. As Faith mentioned earlier in the presentation, the email address for any questions that you guys need to reach out to OASFA about is outreach@oasfa.org. If you go to FAFSA Help Ohio, it will take you to this site, also oaspa.org. Will bring you to the OASPA sites and lead you here as well. But you can see, you know, we've done some webinars, we did some counselor workshops today. So lots of information regarding the resources that are available to not only the parents and students, but also to you guys. One of the things you also can do here is if you are having a FAFSA completion event at your school or your organization, you can list that here. So so it is basically out there for anybody to be able to see and access, or be able to come to your event if it's in their local area. Obviously, the resources that are there for students and parents, there's instructional videos, there's handouts. I've actually used some of these handouts at presentations and things that I've done. You can link this also to your school site. So if that's something that's allowable on your actual school website, you certainly could put this information to where it's right there and accessible to anybody that goes to your website as well. Next slide, okay. If you are having an event and you of course don't feel comfortable being the presenter of that, this is where you guys can go in and request a financial aid night presenter, and someone will respond to you about sending out someone to your school. Or, you know, I know a lot of the presentations this year, you know, have been remote. So, you know, if they continue to be that way, obviously they certainly can present those virtually as well. But you can go here to request that. Of course, there's also, you know, pre-recorded sessions and things that you can get here as well. So if you've not been to the OASPA site, I do encourage you guys to go. But one of the things you can also do is put your name and email address into the College Access and School Counselor Contact Database. Also at this site, several benefits. Workshop registration information is going to come out to you automatically. Counselor event announcements and details, training announcements, all of that information will be found in OASPA's websites, updated, you know, regularly, so that information is up to date, accurate, so you guys can access it. I think that leaves, we have 6 minutes.
We do. Good job. That was a lot of information, and I apologize that we zoomed through those slides as quickly as we did. And I can see, based on the question and answers, that Ed's been keeping up with a lot of the questions. Ed, anything that came up that we should address?
There was just one, Faith, and I'm not sure, and hopefully I'm understanding the question appropriately. It had to do with permanent resident non-citizens, and the question was around if this is a dependent student, but the parents are not considered, you know, a permanent resident non-alien. So basically, if the parents were not a U.S. citizen, not in the U.S., so, you know, outside of the U.S., how do they go about completing the FAFSA, knowing that they don't have a social security number, that they're not a resident? How does one go about doing that, or is that even an option?
So I've not encountered this in all of my years in financial aid, but I do know that the student can, I believe it's all 6s or all 9s.
All zeros.
All zeros, thank you, that they use for the parent. So that indicates to us immediately that they are not a U.S. citizen. And so we're not expecting a social security match to be successful. And then the student has to do the best they can to convert the income into US dollars if they exist. The financial aid administrators can actually sign a FAFSA application on behalf of a student in this scenario. So we would print a signature page and sign and indicate who we are. So this doesn't happen a whole lot, it has never happened at my institution that we've had to do this for. But there are ways around it to get the information on the FAFSA and have it processed for the student. Morley, anything else that I missed, or Jackie?
No, I think you're right. I was just going to see if Sarah is still on the webinar, if we've answered your question. If not, throw something in the chat or in the question box that we can see if
Okay.
we've helped you with an answer to that question.
I did forget to mention as well, this, and Faith mentioned at the beginning, this is recorded, so this will be posted. If you have colleagues that maybe would like to access the information, they'll be able to do that as well from the website, oasfa.org.
So Sarah, for the PDF of the FAFSA, you can get it on the FAFSA website. You can also just Google PDF FAFSA, and it'll come up. Just make sure you have the correct year, and then you have a paper FAFSA. So if students can't do it electronically because parents are out of the country, they can do a paper application as well. So just Google PDF of the FAFSA, and it will come up. So
another
ahead,
question, Faith, and this one had to do with students who, actually, I'm assuming this was along the lines of students who transgender students. So we know that they are to report the gender assigned them on their birth certificate. What happens if they change their name? I did a quick search and I couldn't necessarily find anything definitive, but my assumption is that they go by their legal name. So if they've gone through the process of changing their name legally, that is the name that they would use on the FAFSA. However, they would report the gender that is reported on their birth certificate. Is that correct?
That's correct. So the gender is what was assigned on your birth certificate or the student's birth certificate. The name is exactly as it appears on their current Social Security card. So if they've gone through the effort of changing their name through Social Security, that is the name that they would use on the FAFSA.
Perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions? Throw them in the chat. Your last chance here. 2 more minutes to go. Ed, anything we should address?
The only other thing I see is certificates of attendance, some certificates of completion. Will we be issuing those to attendees?
We can do that. You simply have to send an email to that address you saw, outreach@oasfa.org, and indicate that you would like to have your letter of attendance, and we will send those to you. Well,
we, again, very much appreciate you all taking the time. I know every one of us are very busy right now, especially you counselors trying, as I mentioned earlier, trying to just get to the point of graduation. So we hope this was helpful for you. Again, please reach out to OASFA through our outreach email and on our resources page, and let us know what we can do to help you and your students. We want to get these students in and enrolled this fall and have their aid in place in time for fee payment. Jackie, anything to wrap up?
Think of anything else?
All right, well, that includes our presentation. Thank you all and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.